Good morning and welcome to the Resolution Foundation. My name is Lindsay Judge. I'm one of the research directors here at the Foundation, and I have the great pleasure today of chairing this event, which is part of our Need to Know General Election series, which is supported by the Nuffield Foundation. So many thanks to them. Today the topic we're looking at is social security, past, present and future. And of course the social security system is one that's undergone a huge overhaul over the last decade, 14 years. So we'll be looking back and taking stock, but we'll also, of course, be looking forward and thinking about the critical issues in the social security system that the next government is going to have to grapple with going forward. I'm joined by an amazing panel today. So on my right-hand side is my colleague Alex Clegg. Alex is an economist here at the Foundation, and he's one of the co-authors of the report that we're publishing today, and he'll be taking you through some of the key findings from that report shortly to kick us off. And then I'll turn to our other panelists. So we're joined by Ben Baumberg-Geiger, and Ben is Professor in Social Sciences and Health at King's College London, has an illustrious career, and I can't think of a single aspect of the benefit system I don't think you've been involved or haven't researched, Ben, but I know Ben's work in particular around lived experience of the benefit system, and also Ben's very expert on public opinions around benefits, and I think was one of the co-authors of the welfare chapter of the British Social Attitudes Survey report last year. And then we'll turn to Kitty Stewart, and Kitty is Associate Director at the Centre for Analysis and Social Exclusion at London School of Economics. And Kitty's research is also wide-ranging. I think I was kind of amazed when I looked at your biog last night, Kitty, but is particularly expert in issues around child poverty and around family incomes and the impact that they have on wider outcomes, and is one of the co-investigators of the larger Families Project, which I think is also supported by the Nuffield Foundation. So huge expertise on the panel here. A couple of things before I turn over to them. The first thing to say is I have absolutely no doubt that we will have lots of questions and lots of discussion on the topic of disability benefits. It's a huge issue, obviously, in the benefits system at the moment. Just to say we have another event on that topic, same time, same place next week. So if some of the questions on that issue we don't get to, come along next week and join and ask those questions then, or if not, we'll try and bring them over into that discussion too. So we'll try and keep it relatively high level today, but we can, of course, return into a sort of deep dive on that topic next week. It's obviously of critical importance. And the other thing to say is, I don't think it's going to happen, but there's a slim chance that the Labour Party's manifesto is going to drop in the middle of this event. You have a privilege that we don't, which is you can look at your phones. We can't. But if there's anything in there, I don't think there's going to be, but if there is anything in there on social security that you want to ask us about, please do. But just remember that you have the advantage over us in that you've been able to read what's in there and we haven't. So I think without further ado, I will hand over to Alex for a quick overview of the report.
Thanks, Lindsay. I'll try and keep it quick. I was told off this morning for having a few too many slides, so bear with me if it gets long, but we'll try and get through it nicely. So yeah, as Lindsay said, I'm going to be talking about the last 14 years of the social security system, all the big changes that have happened, and what the next government will have to grapple with. So total social security expenditure has risen slightly from the eve of the financial crisis, from 10% of GDP to 11.2% this year. This is driven by increases in expenditure on the state pension, which now accounts for 44% of all social security expenditure, and largely on non-pension disability and incapacity benefits, which is now almost half of all non-pensioner benefits. But this relatively modest rise masks some really, really huge changes in the social security system that have happened since 2010. And I'm going to talk about 4 big changes in particular. Firstly, there's been a huge amount of structural reform. Obviously, this is dominated by the introduction of universal credit, which replaced 6 of the major working age means-tested benefits with a single payment and a single application system. Universal credit isn't the only new benefit in town. Disability living allowance, the main benefit for covering the costs of disability, has been replaced by personal independence payment. The national council tax benefit has been devolved to local council tax support. and Scotland's introduced new benefits for disability and for children. The result of this is that 2/3 of all non-pensioner social security expenditure now goes on benefits that didn't exist at all in 2010. A second major change is that the long-held principle to annually uprate working age benefits in line with inflation has been largely undermined. Over the last 14 years, 7 of those years we've either had benefits frozen or uprated at a rate below inflation. The result of this is that the basic rate of unemployment benefits is now 7.6% lower in real terms than it was in 2010. In contrast, there's been a new settlement for uprating the state pension. The triple lock has meant that the state pension has grown faster than earnings and faster than prices, and is now, in real terms, 16% higher than it was in 2010. A third big change is in how people interact with the system. This is largely a result of the introduction of universal credit as well, which has made 2 big changes to conditionality rules. So the first one is that before universal credit, there was 2 groups in particular that had no conditionality rules applied as a condition of them receiving benefits. That's people who were claiming housing benefit or tax credits only. Rolling those benefits into universal credit means that universal credit's work search rules now apply to that group. And universal credit for the first time has also extended conditionality to people in work who are deemed not to be working enough or earning enough. The result of this is that at the end of last year, there were more than 3 million people subject to some form of conditionality, including 760,000 people in work. And that's up from a low of 1.8 million in 2016, just before the rollout of universal credit really got going. And the fourth big change has been the devolution and localization of social security. This should be understood as 2 separate phenomena, really. So Scotland, and to a lesser extent Wales, have been devolved powers for instance, Scotland has now powers over its own disability benefits, carers benefits, maternity benefits. They've introduced mitigation for the benefit cap and introduced the Scottish Child Payment. And those powers were largely sought and largely welcomed, and have been used to pursue, indeed, their own agendas for social security where possible. The other side of this is the delegation of responsibility to local authorities, who have been given a lot more responsibility to deliver discretionary support and crisis support. And this has largely been to cover up some of the holes in the safety net that cuts to the national working age system have caused. So as you can see on the chart, expenditure on discretionary housing payments went up 7-fold between 2011 and 2013. This was largely done deliberately. The UK government extended that funding in order to mitigate some of the cuts to housing support that had been enacted on the national system, things like cuts to the local housing allowance and the introduction of the benefit cap. The local authorities have been a bit more mixed in their reaction to these responsibilities, largely due to the funding pressures that have come with them. For example, the devolution of council tax support came with a 10% cut in funding, which means that localised council tax support schemes are now largely less generous than the previous national council tax benefit. So there's been a great deal of change in the system. We've got, the system as we have now is very different from the one we had in 2010. But the best way to understand these changes, specifically for working age households, is to look at three separate periods since 2010, each with its own focus of reforms and each with different impacts on the benefit claiming population. So looking at 2010 to 2015, when the new Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition government came in, a lot of the political agenda was about scaling back support for higher and middle income households that had been extended by the previous government, and also in cutting some of the generosity of needs-based support in order to try and control some of the spending on social security. The impact of this was, in cash terms, largely even across the distribution. So things like the introduction of child benefit means testing hit richer households. whereas a 3-year below inflation uprating and cuts to the local housing allowance hit poorer households. But if you look at it as a percentage of total income, you can see that these changes were quite regressive, with households in the poorest fifth losing about 6% of their income compared to 0.8% for the richest fifth. Then from 2015, in the budget of 2015, Chancellor George Osborne announced a 4-year freeze in working age benefit rates. This was largely done because the savings that they wanted to make were not quite being achieved by the previous cuts. So a much broader and heavy-handed range of cuts was imposed. This had a really strong negative impact and a really strong regressive impact on the income distribution, with the working age households in the bottom fifth of the income distribution losing £2,800 per year on average from changes in this period. And there's been a different approach since 2019. There haven't been any further cuts. Indeed, benefits have been uprated every year since 2020, despite a few years of really, really high inflation. And there's been an extension of support to households in work claiming universal credit. But a lot of the impacts of this period also come from policies that were announced and started in previous periods, rolling out in earnest and having their impact. So we've got the rollout of universal credit, which largely had mixed effects, but overall largely boosted incomes for low-income households in work. But you can see here the negative impact of the 2-child limit and what that's done to the poorest households. Crucially, any of the gains from the last 5 years have not anywhere near offset the losses of the last 14. So here we're looking at all working age households since 2010 and all social security changes. As you can see, there's been a very negative and regressive impact, with some of the poorest households losing more than £3,000 per year on average. The story for pensioners has been much different. It's a story of stability and of income boosts largely across the distribution. This is mostly due to the introduction of the triple lock and the new state pension, which is offset slightly for some of the poorest households by cuts to the local housing allowance and things like rule changes that have meant that mixed age couples now claim universal credit instead of pension credit, which is much more generous. Quite a different story for pensioners. And then altogether, these impacts have had these policies have had different impacts on different groups. So here we're looking at just families claiming some sort of benefit, and we can see that changes since 2010 mean that working age families have lost an average of £1,500, while pensioners have gained £900. And it's households with children that have lost out the most. This is unsurprising because we've had means testing of child benefit, we've had the introduction of the 2-child limit, we've had cuts to child tax credit, we've had the introduction of the benefit cap, which affects larger families more. So because of all these things, households with 3 or more children have lost an average of £4,600 per year due to all benefit changes since 2010. Lone parents have lost £2,600 per year on average. And we also see households out of work losing more than £2,000. This is largely due to the reduction in the real value of unemployment support. So that's what's happened over the last 14 years. That's the system that the next government will inherit. And here's what the situation is looking forward. So over the next parliament, by 2028, there's a forecast increase in real terms of £21 billion in spending on social security expenditure. And this is largely driven by 2 upward pressures that have been quite well acknowledged in the political debate. So the expenditure on the state pension is set to rise by £9.5 billion in real terms over this period. That's driven by an 8% increase in the number of pensioners and a 3.6% rise in the value of the state pension due to the triple lock. Obviously, both parties have already committed to keeping this, so that expenditure looks pretty nailed on. And the other big acknowledged upward pressure is increased expenditure on non-pensioner disability and incapacity benefits, which is set to rise by £9.7 billion in real terms over the next 4 years. There's obviously a big debate. This is a lot more debated than the state pension. The Conservative Party have pledged that they will save £12 billion from this expenditure. We're a little sceptical of whether that is realistic. It will involve some quite heavy cuts to working age disability support, and the history of disability benefit reform suggests that any savings from disability reforms are quite difficult to achieve. And outside of these two big acknowledged pressures, there are some things that are going largely unacknowledged, but are arguably unsustainable in the social security system. This isn't driven by big forecasts of increasing expenditure. So looking at all other benefits outside the state pension and disability and incapacity benefits, the forecast only expects a £1.6 billion rise in real terms spending by 2028, so quite a modest rise. But of course, this forecast assumes that the system will carry on in its current shape. And that means that the next government would be accepting a range of policies that are potentially unsustainable. For example, it would mean that them keeping the two-child limit, which we estimate that if that's kept in place, households with 3 or more children, so children in households with 3 or more children, 51% of them would be in poverty by the end of the next parliament. It also means keeping in the local housing allowance freeze, even though rents are set to rise by 13% over the next 3 years. And it means keeping in place the benefit cap, which affects 77,000 families at the moment and will continue to rise. There's also little sense that core benefit levels are adequate as they are now. We have record numbers of households using food banks. We have record levels of homelessness. Indeed, the number of households in temporary accommodation has more than doubled since 2011. And this means that even keeping the social security system in its current shape could well lead to rising public expenditure in other areas, particularly health, also in local government. One example of the rise in temporary accommodation is very, very expensive for local government, who are increasingly relied upon to fill some of the gaps in the safety net. So in conclusion, the next government's going to inherit a system that's gone through a radical amount of reform and modernisation over the last 14 years, but also one in which benefit rates have fallen drastically in real terms, spending has shifted from working age families to pensioners, and one in which the link between entitlement and need has been broken. And that's going to be a really challenging policy area to try and get to grips with for whoever forms the next government. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Alex. A masterful summary of a paper, and I would definitely commend the full report to you because Alex has only given you a taste of it. I'm looking at the iPad here and thinking, why haven't I got very many questions? And there's a really obvious reason, which is I forgot to tell you what the hashtag was for you to post your questions on Slido. So please do that. The hashtag is hashtag welfare state, and I think it's on the bottom of that slide there, so you can see it there. So do get your questions coming in. But while you have a think and cogitate about what Alex has just told you about, let's hear from Ben.
So thanks, Lindsay, for inviting me to speak, and thanks, Alex and Mike, for a really interesting paper. I'm going to sort of talk about two totally different sets of things in my 6 or 7 minutes. So the first one that I want to talk about is just to try and clarify some of the things that have changed. So Alex has given a really good summary of what has changed in terms of spending, but there's still a way in which I think people are misunderstanding what has been going on, and then because of this, what the challenges going forward are. So within this, the first thing to say is the trend in the number of claimants is wholly misleading. And we can tell this because there's something called the alternative claimant count, which was a DWP effort to try and count things consistently as universal credit came in. And it showed that the claimant count, which I won't go into the details of, but is one particular measure of how many people are claiming unemployment benefits, was in fact nearly 1 million people higher in the 2010s when they were doing this counting. So what we know is that the introduction of universal credit will automatically make it seem like there are more people claiming benefits because UC just counts people differently. And all of this conversation about rising numbers of people claiming incapacity-related benefits, we simply don't know if there are more people claiming or not because there hasn't been an effort to do the same sort of alternative count that does things consistently from DWP, and we don't have the data to be able to do it externally. So I've blogged about this a lot on my Substack Inequalities, so if you want more detail on it, go there, and I can come back to it in the Q&A. But that's just one, you don't trust the kind of caseload picture that you get from admin data. Secondly, and connected to that, in terms of spending, I think it doesn't make sense to say that non-pensioner benefit spending is out of control because of rises in disability and incapacity, particularly disability benefits spending. So if we exclude pensioner benefits and put working age adults and children's benefits together, I can come back to the reasons behind this in the Q&A, we see that we're now spending basically the same as we were in 2007. So, excluding the kind of bumps from COVID and from the financial crash in 2008-9, we're not really seeing a major shift. What is happening is that as kind of non-disability benefits have become more and more inadequate, more and more people have been claiming disability-related benefits. And I don't think it makes any sense to take those two things as separate things that are going on. They are really tightly related. So when Alex was talking about that future challenge, there are two separate challenges. One is this rising disability incapacity spending, and the other is the inadequacy of the benefit system. I'd sort of say this is a joint challenge. It's not that spending is out of control, but the attempt to make benefits really, really low is kind of pushing more and more people into claiming disability-related benefits. And there is a question about whether this is both a good thing and sustainable, but the answer is not necessarily to kind of cut disability and incapacity benefits, but just to think about the whole benefit system and how it works for non-pensioner claimants. So, as Lindsay said, Louise and Lindsay have a report coming out at an RF event next week, so we can talk about this more in the Q&A, and there'll be plenty of time to talk about it more next week. But I think it's really important to combine those two bits of it for the time being. The other thing I wanted to talk about is attitudes to the benefit system and what's been going on. So the sort of first thing that's going on, the headline thing, I suppose, so if you're going to look at benefits attitudes since 2007 and 8, is there was a really sharp fall in what I call anti-welfare attitudes. So the view that kind of claimants are mostly undeserving and so on and so forth, that fell precipitously between 2010 and 2019, for reasons that we go into a little bit in last year's British Social Attitudes chapter on it. It's nothing to do with COVID. So this happens before COVID and things don't really change in COVID. The question, I suppose, then, is given that anti-welfare attitudes have fallen to among their lowest level since British Social Attitudes started measuring these things in the 1980s, why have the Conservatives spent so much of the last year and a half, I suppose, kind of having a sort of a more hostile rhetoric to benefit claimants that they had done for the immediate years preceding that? And I think there's sort of three things going on here. The first is, while anti-welfare attitudes, that belief that claimants are undeserving, fell really sharply, other attitudes were a bit more ambivalent. So it's not like there was a massive groundswell of support for more spending. There was a sort of an increase in support for more spending, but it didn't sort of match the change in attitudes to claimants more broadly, possibly because of the wider way in which the finances of the country were being discussed in the media. And also, this wasn't really a priority for most people. There's relatively few people that say that things around welfare or things around poverty and inequality are one of the top issues facing the country at the moment, however you ask it. So while anti-welfare attitudes have fallen, doesn't mean that there's a kind of an overwhelming surge demanding that things are made more generous. The second aspect of this is that despite that, given the state of public attitudes, it is very difficult to do a very kind of widely targeted cut to benefit claimants at the moment. So if you remember during the Liz Truss government, she was trying to institute a cut, not uprating by benefits, and then, there were many Conservative MPs that opposed this. Lots of the usually sympathetic to the Conservatives press opposing it, and it didn't end up happening. And since then, Jeremy Hunt's autumn statement last year, even Conservative voters supported the uprating of benefits by inflation at that point. So a broad-ranging sort of cut to benefits is not going to land very well politically. But that doesn't mean that sort of more targeted sort of rhetoric won't be sort of politically supported. So, for example, the Conservatives talking about more conditionality for long-term unemployed people, which I'm not going to discuss as a policy, we can come back to it, but that's the sort of thing that is relatively popular. And the sort of attack on anxiety and depression within disability and incapacity benefits is, again, sort of more widely supported than a sort of a general attack on benefits are. So public attitudes are complicated. Even though they're more positive than they were, it doesn't mean there's not ways of talking about it that might be more popular. And the other aspect of it is general public attitudes don't always matter. So, the Conservatives are in a process of kind of political positioning for political advantage. My colleague Rob de Vries, who has a nice turn of phrase for things, sort of described this as another arrow in the culture war quiver. So even if it's not kind of everybody thinking something, it might feed into their wider political strategy for what they're trying to do at this election. So then just to sort of finish up about, what has happened to attitudes in the light of the change in tone about talking about the benefit system. So we see a little bit of a shift in the attitudes of Conservative supporters. So the YouGov trackers are the best way of seeing the most recent things. And we do see that Conservative supporters are a little bit more supportive of cuts and a little bit more anti-welfare than they were. But really, this hasn't changed very much compared to how much attitudes changed over the 2010s. So we're not seeing a massive change in response to the Conservative rhetoric about it. It's also worth adding that Conservative supporters are now more likely to think the government is doing a bad job on welfare than they were before. Partly because talking about everything wrong with the system makes everybody think, well, the government has got things wrong with the system. It not necessarily has political consequences, and it's worth adding that even before the recent change in rhetoric, most people thought the government were doing a bad job on welfare, irrespective of their politics. But so it hasn't necessarily had that political dividend. We can maybe come back in the discussion a little bit to what the Conservatives are proposing and what Labour are proposing and where public attitudes goes. But just to say, in summary, public attitudes shifted a lot in the 2010s. There's a space for doing, increases in spending for welfare, but it's not necessarily demanded, and there's also a space for different policies.
Great. Thanks, Ben. I love that mix of the technical and the political. It's just what we're looking for. Kitty, what are your thoughts about the previous 14 years and casting forward as well?
Right. Well, thank you very much for having me. Thanks very much for the report, which I really enjoyed reading. So for me, what emerges very strongly from the report and from the last 14 years is very much that children are the really big story. Families with children and the way that the support for those families has been cut. So a lot of what was in the report is familiar to me, but sometimes the numbers strike you again when you look at them again. And I was really struck by the cut in, so the 1.1 or 1.2% cut in GDP that working age families, including those with children, have seen in terms of the parts of the system that are going to them, whereas 1.4% or something increase in what's going to pensioners. And it made me think of when I first joined CASE back in the early 2000s. John Hills was writing a chapter at that time for a book organised by Jane Waldfogel in the US, and the chapter was called 1% for the Kids. And the chapter was about how the UK, it was like telling the US, look what we're doing in the UK, fantastic stuff. Gordon Brown is putting 1% of GDP into additional support for families with children with a view to tackling child poverty and investing in our future. And so that 1% is, now we're seeing that's been taken out of the system again over the last 14 years. And taking that reduction in support for those families and the way in which it's been done, well, first of all, seems an enormous act of self-harm, given everything we know about the importance of poverty and its impact on children. And of course, these children are going to be our future, going to be looking after us in all sorts of ways in the future. And it's also made our social security system, as we've seen, look really different. So as well as just kind of reducing the level of support going to families, we've seen these really big shifts, some of which Alex has highlighted. And there are three things I think that really strike me about the shifts that have taken place. So with respect to families with children in particular. And the first is this much tighter means testing. So Gordon Brown had this idea of progressive universalism, something for everybody with more for those at the bottom. And we've really seen that principle kind of thrown out and much tighter means testing of benefits. So, of course, the child benefit change, which kind of affluence tests child benefit at the top. But we also saw a real shift to the child tax credit system. 90% of families with children in the early 2000s got child tax credits. This was something for pretty much everybody. Whereas one of the very first acts in that first term was to, target that right down, and then eventually this has become part of universal credit. So this is now a benefit. Instead of being a benefit for families with children, for all of us, for the time when we need it, it's now, something for people who are really on low incomes. And of course, universal credit is seen as a sort of failure benefit in the sense that if you're on universal credit, you should be trying to get off it. It's there for when you need it, but keep working, keep increasing your earnings. The aim is not to be receiving those benefits anymore. So that's a real shift in the way that we see what the social security system is there for. And of course, you could argue that that change kind of paved the way for the later cuts in terms of uprating and so on, as Titmuss said, and many others have said. Poor benefits for the poor are likely to be poor benefits. The second thing is the changes to uprating, which Alex highlighted, which is a kind of dry sort of change, but we know that that's one of the big things that has driven quietly, has been driving the cuts in the level of support for families, for working age families. That is something that we've seen sort of changed in the most recent years. We've gone back to uprating with price inflation, but of course the damage has been done both in terms of the value of those benefits being withered away, and also in terms of the principle. So that long-standing principle that of course they always went up with prices has been kind of challenged, and remains to be seen whether what happens in the future, whether that's going to be a kind of challenged again. And then thirdly, really, really importantly, is this very explicit breaking of the link between needs and entitlement. So that is a really huge change in the way that we think about support. So even if support has not been adequate, there's been a kind of, since the war and since the establishment of the welfare state, you work out what a family needs and that's what they get. Several changes, but most obviously the two-child limit and the benefit cap have really broken that assumption, so that now they work out what the family needs and they don't give the family that support. You get less. What all of this adds up to, firstly, I suppose two things that I sort of wanted to bring out. One is, as we've seen in some of the slides, a system that very deliberately, very intentionally does not provide a safety net anymore. So the safety net is both inadequate because it's been chipped away by the uprating rules, but it's also got these very deliberate holes in it now. And what that means is that families are relying on very insecure forms of support. So the social security system is no longer providing security, and families are having to turn to food banks and charities. In the project that we've been doing, looking at larger families who are affected by the two-child limit and the benefit cap, the range of ways in which that they manage to get by is a very long list. Food banks, charities, family, neighbours, going into debt to various different agencies, more or less kind of savoury, schools, ex-partners, not all of them very pleasant. So in many ways we've kind of gone back to a system where you can't rely on the state. The other aspect of that, I think, showed up is in terms of the support the state itself is providing is also insecure. And I think the one of the charts that really struck me was the discretionary housing payments that you showed. So that huge increase in discretionary housing payments. And of course, that's to do with devolution and localisation, but it's also it's a different way. It's not just that it's local, it's also that it's discretionary. You don't have an entitlement to that support. So where you would have your housing payments covered, you now don't, you're desperate, you go to the council and you have to say, you know, what support is there available for me? And eventually, hopefully, you get some support through discretionary housing payment. But in our interviews with families, that's something that really has come out, is those payments are crucial. They're making a massive difference to families. They're enabling some of them to stay in their housing and not be evicted. But it's not secure. It's very, very uncertain, and that has a huge impact on the family. You know, applying for it, worrying about it, eventually getting it, thank goodness, that's 3 months, and then 3 months later you go through the whole process again. So again, a kind of real shift in the way that the state operates, from entitlement to discretionary, inadequate and discretionary support. The final thing, if I've got 1 minute, I wanted to highlight is something about the way that children are seen in this system. So I've written a paper recently with Ruth Patrick and Aaron Reeves, where we talk about the way that support for children in these recent years has really become not about children, but about adults. So we call it adult behaviour-oriented family benefits. I feel like we need to name it a different name if we want this to catch on. But the idea is this, which is that in European social policy, there's a kind of debate about whether support, you know, how far the way that children are seen is rights-based and sees children as individuals with their own rights. So, for example, a universal child benefit recognises a child, recognises that they can't earn at the moment, and so provides them with support, you know, whatever their family circumstances. Whereas more, and there's lots of countries in Europe that have that kind of principle in their social policy systems. There's also a much more common principle, which is needs-based, so recognising children and their needs, so taking account of children within their family circumstances and making sure that they have what they need to flourish. So there's a sort of debate, which is a nice debate to have, about rights versus needs. What we're seeing in our system is a new thing, a different thing, which is neither about rights nor about needs of children, but is about adults. And so policies like the two-child limit and the benefit cap, children have sort of disappeared into the background. These are benefits for children, but they're being conditioned on adults' behaviour. And they're being used as ways to try to get adults to change their behaviour, whether that's their fertility behaviour, their employment behaviour. And this, I think, this invisibility of children, since we've kind of focused on this, I've realised it's really there right across policy, and is a real concern to me, and something I think we should draw attention to. It's quite unusual in Europe to have almost no aspects of social security for children, which is kind of conditioned on adult behaviour rather than sort of putting children at the forefront. Just finally, more optimistically, although Ben's made it, kind of put lots of caveats on this, I was very encouraged by the figure right at the end, which shows that public attitudes maybe have changed. Again, children are not there. I don't know if they were asked about children, but they're not in the figure. What people think about benefits for children, but it does look like there's, people are seeing some of this stuff. They're seeing the food banks, and they're seeing the levels of need among families, and maybe wanting something a bit different. Ben's told us it's much more complicated than that, but I'd like to hold on to that note of optimism. Thank you.
Thanks, Kitty. That was great, Kitty. Thank you. Good to hear about the lived experience work, and also nice to end on a note of optimism. What's felt rather a kind of slightly downbeat discussion so far. Let's do lots of looking forward in the Q&A. Since I gave you the hashtag there, I've been inundated with questions. It's sort of cause and effect, I think. But there's one which is a question of clarification, which I might take, actually, because it's about disability benefits. So I don't want to put you on the spot, Alex, which is just a question from Neil. Apologies if I got your name, I mispronounced your name. It says, do your current projections of spend take account of the proposed reforms to the WCA and PIP? And the answer to that is the figures we use looking forward for spend, both for disability benefits and all types of social security spending, are from the OBR. And they do indeed take into account the proposed plans around WCA, but they do not take into account the announcements that the Conservative Party made at the weekend around PIP. So some of the policies that are floating around in the manifesto are costed, and some of them are not in those costings already. Let's turn to your multitude of questions. Now, I thought we might give some form to this discussion by leaning on this really phenomenal title that we have on the report, hat tip to our comms department, which is Ratchets, Retrenchment and Reform. And I thought we might sort of take it in three chunks and talk first about ratchets and then turn to retrenchment and then reform, and to try and give some shape to our discussion. But maybe just as a really quick helper, Alex, why don't you just explain to us what we're talking about when we say ratchets?
Yeah, so we're largely talking about uprating. And in terms of ratchets, we're really talking about the triple lock, which was a new agreement brought in 2010 to uprate the state pension. And the way it works is that every April, the state pension is uprated by the highest of average earnings or prices from the year before, or 2.5%. And that creates kind of a baseline, meaning that over time the state pension will rise faster than earnings and prices. The flip side of this is working age uprating. The way this works is that every April, well, the way the principle works is that in April, working age benefits are uprated by the previous September's CPI. As I mentioned in the presentation, that hasn't always happened, and it hasn't happened for half of the last 14 years. Another issue that comes from this is that we have this lagged effect between when the inflation rate is taken and then uprating 6 months later. In normal inflation times, this doesn't have a great effect. When we have a period of really high inflation like we've had during the cost of living crisis, it means that the actual rate of inflation used to uprate can be very different from the real one at the time when uprating happens. It's a bit technical, but because of this, the real value of unemployment benefits actually fell by more across 2022-23 than it did for the entire period of the benefit freeze from 2015 to 2020, just because inflation was going so high across that year, and we have this lagged effect of uprating. Does that make sense?
Upward ratchet on basic state pension
And
downward ratchet on working age.
Yeah.
Let's go to one of your questions. There's been lots about issues around sort of fairness between pensioners and working age, but there's a question here which I think sums it up, which says both parties have said they're committed to the triple lock on the basic state pension. Is that a good thing or a bad thing for the country looking forward? And let me come to Kitty first.
Well, I don't understand. I mean, I'm a fan of the double lock. I think it's right that these benefits should rise with the highest of earnings and prices. I'm very happy for pensioners to have that. I think that's good. I would like to see that extended to families with children and to working age benefits more generally. I don't understand the triple lock, but I've never understood that. Like, why prices, earnings, or 2.5%? That has never made sense to me. So I would make it a double lock, and I would extend it to all benefits.
Well, I think you're probably more expensive than me. I think the 2.5% was deliberately there to ratchet it up to tackle pensioner poverty. I think that's correct, isn't it? But
that, and also a will not to undermine the savings incentive for retirement, because the means tested pensioner benefits were quite generous. So it's like bringing up the sort of universal pension
For the state pension, yeah. No, that makes sense. But I would, given where we are today, I would move to a double lock and extend it.
But it also shows that a ratchet works if you want to tackle poverty, right?
Yes, it does. It does show that.
Ben, what are your thoughts on the fairness between working age children and pensioners?
So I think the first thing to say is that, in the 1980s and 1990s, we had really high pensioner poverty. And so higher pensions is in some ways a good thing. And the fact that pensioner poverty is now lower than working age poverty is a sign that this has actually been effective. Although, as the report points out, the increases haven't really been felt at the bottom of the income distribution. And we do still have non-negligible amounts of pensioner poverty. I sort of feel like the trouble with the triple lock is it's not saying this is where we want to get the state pension to be, and we're going to get there through smoothing out in a process of a triple lock. It just becomes a kind of a political bind that nobody ever seems to be able to get out of. And I think it might be sensible just to say, this is our vision of how generous we want the state pension to be. And we're going to keep going with the triple lock until we reach this point, and then we have a generous basic state pension. I also, it's just kind of a separate thing, I also think we need to think about the impending state pension age rises that's happening in the next parliament. And I think pension age rises are harder when you don't have a system of social security, particularly incapacity benefits, that people feel is secure and reassures them at all. So I think taking things in the round, but I mean, it seems like we're really concerned about 67-year-olds, but not about 65-year-olds at the moment. So it is sensible to try and rebalance these things a bit.
Great. Let's move on to retrenchments, where I think we might have even more to talk about. There's a good question here, which I think I might pose to all of the panellists, which says, what do you think has been the most damaging cut to benefits over the last decade, and why? Ben, let's start with you on that one.
I mean, probably between the two-child limit and the general inadequacy of benefits, but I will leave Kitty to talk more about the two-child limit.
Yeah, well, the two-child limit, but I would also put the benefit cap up there. I mean, so the two-child limit, it has affected more families and is year on year affecting more families, and is creating this huge hole in the safety net and the support available. But the benefit cap is often overlooked. I mean, sometimes people think it's the same thing. The benefit cap is the cap on the overall level of support that a family can receive. So if you have high housing costs, you're often kind of bumping. If you're not in work, it applies if you're not in work, or if you're working very low hours and you don't receive disability benefits, you're bumping up against this threshold, which was brought down and then has been frozen mostly in cash terms. So more and more people are kind of dragged into that. That affects relatively few families. I mean, it's now 70,000 or so families compared to 1 point something million currently for the two-child limit. So it's smaller, but for those families, it has absolutely devastating effects. It really means that they are living often in really levels of destitution, because house prices are high and have been rising over the last decade. And you're telling these families, we're not covering those housing costs. And, often there are very good reasons, very good constraints on why work is difficult at this stage, whether that's, health difficulties or children's health difficulties or very young children. And, one family that we talked to are living in a family with 3 young children under 4, a couple, and they have various complications, and they're living on £65 a week. I mean, for a family of 5, and it's so I would really, it's quite small in terms of the difference the amount of money that you need, but you could make a huge difference to those families. So, yeah, benefit cap and the two-child limit, I'd say.
Yeah, Alex, do you have anything?
Yeah, I mean, I think
haven't been taken already.
I think we should also mention the LHA freeze, the local housing allowance, which is the maximum amount of housing support that people can get, which has been frozen a number of times. It was uprated this year, but is set to be frozen again. And it's been quite highly correlated with levels of homelessness locally. I think one of the big issues is it creates these arbitrary and different geographical problems, because if the rate's frozen around the country, if rents soar in one area, it means that people in that area, their housing costs are, less of their housing costs are covered by benefit support than in other areas. And it's kind of a situation where we don't really have a handle on what the system is doing and what the system is providing. We're kind of letting these problems pop up in different areas. It's unpredictable. It means that it's hard to actually quantify the welfare offer that we are providing to families. And the other side of this is that it really shows up in local government financing problems, because they spend so much money on addressing homelessness for families that they have that responsibility for, particularly in temporary accommodation, but also in just spending on crisis support that comes up.
Your answer has led me to another question on Slido, which is a great question, which is, to what extent does the panel think that the cuts and the changes and the reforms over the last 14 years have had different effects spatially. Do we see that? I mean, you've talked obviously on the LHA side, it's self-evident, but I mean, Kitty, on the benefit cap, does that have spatially different impacts?
Well, initially, certainly. I mean, you saw it was London. It's higher in London, but even so, London and the southeast were the areas that were most affected by it. But increasingly, because it's been frozen, it's sort of spreading across. I mean, there are very few. We're just doing some work now to try and work out like how far would you? Because one of the ideas is you should move into work, or you should move house, and so we're kind of looking how far would you have to go to reach a house that you could afford. And you have, there are very small pockets of the country now in the north where it doesn't really bite. Yeah.
I did some interesting work in a previous job where we were looking at areas around the country which would be affordable to certain family types, bearing in mind the LHA and the benefit cap. And I started by creating a really large spreadsheet and coding out all of the benefit rates that families would get if they were out of work. And then applied a colour coding so it would show red if something was unaffordable and green with all the local areas down the side. And pressed OK on the colour coding and it just went red, bam. It was like, oh dear, this is way more than I thought it was going to be.
And you alluded in your presentation to this shift towards, localisation of benefits, certainly around the discretionary side, but also the devolution. Can you say a little bit more about what's going on in Scotland and Wales?
So there's different things going on in Scotland and Wales. Scotland now has powers for its own disability benefits with the adult disability payment. As far as I understand, it's largely operating in a similar way to PIP. But Scotland has introduced mitigation for the benefit cap, where households are automatically granted a discretionary housing payment if they apply for one and they're subject to the benefit cap. Obviously, it doesn't happen automatically. They still have to know that this support's available. And Scotland and Wales have their own council tax support schemes, which are more generous generally than the average ones in England. Anything else? I can't think of anything.
I think you've certainly covered everything I can think of. And if anybody in the room thinks of anything else, let us know. Let's go to another question on Slido, and this one is from Jamie. So Jamie has said, Alex's presentation shows there's a lot of pressure building up for the future. Do you think the government will have to cut benefits for disabled people? Obviously, we saw the announcement in the Conservative manifesto, they trailed it on Sunday and obviously came out on Tuesday, suggesting there could be as much as £12 billion worth of cuts heading the way of people with health conditions. Ben, what do you think?
So the two bits to the answer. So the first is around the Conservatives' proposed cuts to disability benefits, by which I mean PIP. I think, like a lot of other people, that's very unlikely to be realised. But just to explain how this tends to work politically when people are reforming disability-related benefits in different countries, is that it's very easy to tell a story in advance that says, only this group of people that we're saying are not really deserving of benefits are going to be affected. And actually, you're not going to see any real consequences for poverty or destitution among people that you care about, which is a quite divisive way of putting it, but it's a common way in which governments try to justify these things. And then the reality of it is, particularly the scale of cuts to PIP that we're talking about, lots of people are going to be affected. And that's going to include the sorts of people that the Daily Mail and Express care a lot about. So I think even a Conservative government would find it really difficult to implement this. And they could talk about it in advance and there wouldn't be a problem. But as it gets closer to doing it, or just after it's been done, there would be a lot of political pushback, which would make it really difficult. So that's just a kind of a specific doubt about it. I suppose more broadly, going back to what I said at the start, I don't think the government has to cut benefits for disabled people. I think it's really dangerous the way in which we're talking about the increases in disability-related spending without mentioning the kind of declines in other working age benefit spending, because those two things are related. So in some ways, in an ideal world, a radical reform that would deal with the general adequacy of the benefit system would also probably put a lot less pressure on people to claim disability-related top-ups, which might also mean that people feel better, because disability assessments are unpleasant things to go to, particularly when so much rides on them, your ability to afford a roof over your head and so on. So I don't think the government has to cut benefits for disabled people, but I do think there is a need to address this wider issue of adequacy, which disability sort of feeds into in that way.
Great, thanks. Kitty, let me come to you with another question, which is, there's a great statistic in Alex and Mike's report which shows that 73% now believe, of the population now believe there's a great deal of poverty in the UK, and that's the highest proportion since 1986 when the question was first asked. So my question for you is, do you feel hopeful for the future?
I mean, in a sense, that's so... yeah, there's sort of something very depressing about that also, because it shows how far levels of poverty have risen and are visible. I mean, that people are noticing this. On the other hand, it's encouraging that people are aware of it, I suppose, and want to do something about it. Do I feel hopeful? I mean, I do feel so, yeah. Things might be about we've had a particular set of governments with a certain set of with particular agenda over the last 14 years, and policy decisions that have been made have very directly contributed to that to the rise in poverty that we've seen. So a change of government, they've been very careful about not promising anything. So even though 73% say there's a great deal of poverty, we're not. Well, let's see what the manifesto says. I hope there will be a mention of child poverty in there, and a sort of general commitment to do something about child poverty. I guess I feel more optimistic now than over the last few years that we might see a change. I mean, it's a really urgent problem that so many people are noticing it, and we know it's really damaging children's lives and their childhoods, and also it's just, as I've said before, it's so short-sighted to allow people to grow up in conditions where they're not able to achieve what they would otherwise be able to achieve. So, and I tend to be an optimistic person. So yes, I'm optimistic that things are going to change.
Can I just add a 30-second sort of coda to that and what I said before, is that, looking back to the American New Deal or the Beveridge Report, it doesn't really happen that in kind of radical increases in generosity, radical reforms, that there's kind of massive demand from the public that this has to happen. But there is a space where a government can persuade the public for things that ultimately are very popular. So it's about leadership, and it's a space in which political leadership is possible. And I think that's the moment we're in at the moment.
Great, thanks for that. I think we'll move on from retrenchment and start on our final chunk of discussion around reform. And let's also have another positive question. So this one is from Anonymous. The question is, universal credit and PIP were both introduced to solve, not cause problems in the benefit system. Do you think they were positive developments? So I guess we're thinking about the sort of structural aspects here rather than the underlying cuts that also took place alongside them. But Alex, let's hear your thoughts first.
Yeah, I mean, so universal credit is obviously a huge reform, and it's created some really positive things and some less positive things. For families in work, I think it's generally a better system. The way that withdrawal works as people earn more is much more even and makes more sense than some of the issues that were caused by a lot of overlapping with withdrawal rates from the old benefit system. And I think the digitisation and modernisation of the system was quite long overdue. I mean, it's often pointed to the success in the pandemic when 5 million people overnight claimed universal credit, and the system largely coped with it. I think this is to be attributed to the investment in the system, in the IT system backing it up, which obviously had its problems at the start, but was able to handle that level of increase when many countries across Europe had real issues with the same thing happening. But then I think with universal credit there is an issue of it was all about simplification. We need to make the benefit system simpler to understand and to interact with. And I think there's a flip side of that, whereas we've maybe lost some of the complexity of the system that was serving people with quite complex needs. I think you'll get into this a lot more next week with the way that universal credit works for people with health conditions. But one example is an issue with creating this very binary system of you either get the extra element for having the health condition, which means your payments are £400 per month higher, or you don't, and you have this extra conditionality applied. Creates a real incentive for people to get into that group of having that, having that extra element. But I think, there's just issues with this huge simplification of a very complex system that is going to kind of, blur some of the edges and create some problems on the margins. In terms of PIP, I know that PIP was the impact assessment at the time when PIP was introduced was that it would cut 20% of the bill of DLA, which it replaced, which it hasn't done. I'm not sure if we got the figure for how much it's gone up, but the spending on PIP has gone up by quite a lot. I don't think I'm best placed to talk about all of the intricacies of the assessment process, but I think...
let's ask Ben about that.
Yeah, let's ask Ben.
Ben.
I mean, the first thing to say about PIP is that the UK is really unusual in having a benefit like PIP or DLA that came before it. So many countries will offer kind of a combination of kind of cash and the provision of care for disabled people towards independent living in one sort or another. But something that is just a genuine cash benefit for disabled people who are in the best position to know how to spend it, to live independently, is something that we should be really proud of. And, I know lots of people that are kind of submitting responses to the consultation to defend the principle of it. DLA actually came about under the John Major government in the 1990s. Whether PIP was a positive development, kind of more debatable, but the general principle of DLA or PIP as a benefit is something that I think we should be really aware of how unique it is and how positive it is in lots of ways. I guess going back to Alex's point about universal credit, I just think there's pros and cons of universal credit, but if you're going to go for it, you need to think seriously how you're actually going to deliver personalised conditionality. And there was never really any attention to a framework of administrative justice for universal credit. And I think really the positives of it are only really worth having if you have a proper system of administrative justice, as well as dealing with the 5-week wait, which is also a very difficult and built-in issue.
Kitty, what are your thinking about the last 14 years?
So positive. There's obviously a logic to universal credit in its simplicity and bringing everything together, making it more clear to people what they get and what would change, and withdrawing that slowly. So one of the key things was bringing a new housing benefit into that, so that previously, if you received housing benefit, you could be on your marginal effective tax rate could be extremely high, and as I think the report shows, or was I looking at something else? I'm getting confused. Yes, it does show.
What we did on UC.
It's the previous report, that shows that it really kind of brings down some of the very high marginal effective tax rates, even though it also brings up rates for other people. So that all makes sense. But I agree with Alex that there's a flip side to a number of aspects of. Well, firstly, having everything in one basket is very, very risky. So if your payment is delayed, or you have your 5-week wait, which is built into the system, although it doesn't need to be, that's your whole level of support. Whereas before, you had your child tax credit coming in, you knew that was there, and then you lost your job or whatever, so you had to wait. Maybe if your unemployment benefits come through, you were more covered. I think there are risks to having this all in one basket. It's also much harder to get support, say the child element, to the main carers. It all goes into one pot. One shared, and you can choose who that is, but it's more difficult to say, right, this bit is for children and it's going to be separate, and it may be harder for people to see that this is, the child element and should be going to the main carer to spend on children. And the other thing that I as I've sort of alluded to before, I think that there are risks in, it's rolled up with a different way of seeing what the benefit system is there for. and what social security is there for. So it's very much about, look, this is a little bit of money for you when you're on a low income, and your goal is to get off of this. Whereas we could see our system, as many other countries do, as part of this is providing as aspects of benefits going to everybody. We could move back towards that, I think, with a kind of more universal child benefits. To me, that's one of the dangers of it, is that it makes benefits something for poor people. And I think there are different aspects to it. Some of it should be there for when you really need it, when you're on low earnings, and some of it is more kind of about life course and about supporting all people at different stages in their lives. And we've moved away from that with universal credit.
Great. That discussion is a perfect segue into the sort of last cluster of questions. And again, there's quite a lot on Slido, so apologies if I can't pick all of them. But it's essentially, there's a set of questions around work incentives. So there's a question. Oh, hold on, that's the wrong one. That one there. The question from Anonymous. Who are you, the Anonymous? What about work incentive? Wasn't reducing poverty traps one of the inspirations for universal credit? What are marginal tax rates for people coming off benefits? Can you deal with the technical question there?
Yes. So marginal tax rates are the total amount of your earnings. If you earn an extra £1, what's the total proportion that are lost through tax and benefit withdrawal? And this was one of the big talking points when universal credit was introduced, because, as Kitty alluded to in the previous answer, the legacy benefit system could often create some quite arbitrary marginal tax rates as people earned more. And the really steep one was when people were claiming housing benefit and tax credits together, which would mean that the housing benefit was withdrawn as they earned more, and their tax credits were withdrawn as they earned more, and these interacted to create a very high rate of withdrawal. And what universal credit did is introduced a flat taper rate of initially 65%, and then was lowered to 63%, and then lowered again to 55%, meaning people keep more of what they earn. That's like, if you look at the curves of how incomes withdrawn with universal credit compared to the old system, it's much smoother as people move up the earnings scale. So in those kind of work, what we're talking about is, if you go into work or if you earn more, how much of your earnings do you get to keep, and how much is lost through tax and benefits. But obviously there's other sides to work incentives, which I think we should probably talk about.
Yeah, let me broaden the question out, perhaps, and Ben, Kitty. I guess one of the sort of things I wanted to ask you about was, and again, sort of looking forward rather than looking back, is what more do you think the government should be thinking about, the next government should be thinking about, when it comes to helping those who are claiming benefits either get into work or to flourish and progress in work or to stay in work, especially for those, of course, with health conditions. So it's kind of, presumably it's not just all about the marginal deduction rates and the likes. Kitty, what are your thoughts?
Right. Well, I guess I want to say two things, I think, on this. So one is, of course, it's not just about that. It's also about, the other barriers. We've done a lot. There's been a lot of work on that marginal tax rate side of things, and the financial incentives to work, and it has led to many more people, many more parents also going in work. There are lots of other barriers. So, childcare is an obvious one. So making childcare accessible and affordable would, I think, make a big difference. But the other thing I want to say is maybe this is sort of slightly questioning the question a little bit, or the premise, which is that what the change that I'd really like to see is for us to realise that it's not all just about work, and that actually tackling poverty is not just all about work. And that's something I think we've seen really clearly. So we've seen more and more parents working. A lot of these policies have been sort of kind of effective at getting parents into work. Interestingly, if you look at the pre-tax and transfer poverty rates, so the kind of market income poverty rates for families with children, those have also risen. So you've got more and more people working, and yet the pre-tax and transfer poverty rates are also rising. So there's a kind of paradox that for any individual family, getting into work makes sense and reduces their risk of poverty. There's no question about that. And so, childcare, all sorts of other things we need to think about. But for society as a whole, it doesn't seem to be the answer. And that's partly because poverty is relative. And so as more and more families have two parents working, other families who, for one reason or another, can't have that situation are left further behind. And of course, there are always going to be families who, at this stage, work isn't the right answer. You know, they've got a child with severe health needs and they need to be at home for this kind of temporary period of their life course. So I would really like us to understand that it's great to have, we need to support more and more people into work, but we also need to recognise that that's not an alternative to redistribution. In fact, the more and more people that we have working, the more redistribution, not the less redistribution they need to do. So that's probably not quite a fair answer to your question, but
well,
that's what I would say.
It's answering a lot. There's quite a lot of questions on Slido. Again, apologies not coming to them about in-work poverty, so it's sort of touching on that. Ben, what are your thoughts on this intersection between the benefit system and work?
Yeah, so to completely agree with what Kitty said, but to add another element to that, which is even when we're thinking about work, we need to think beyond the kind of narrow financial incentive side of it to look at kind of what are the things that influence people's rational decision about whether to work or not. And Kaylee Hignall of Citizens Advice wrote a really useful blog on this last year, and I know that they and we are doing work on it. So if you think about it at the moment, one of the other things that's gone on is that there is a very widespread lack of trust in the system, particularly for people with health conditions and disabilities, but also more broadly, which means that for many people, their rational decision in a situation where they don't trust that they're going to get enough to live on is cling on for dear life to whatever entitlements you've got, because if you take a punt and try and work or work more hours, you don't know if it doesn't work out, you're going to be able to get back to where you are at the moment. So within that, I think thinking about broader experiences and thinking about the broader issue of trust in the system. If we want a benefit system where it's encouraging people to go into work as much as possible, we need to deal with adequacy and we need to deal with trust. And I suppose helpfully for the next government coming in, you know, restoring trust requires a radical change. It requires political leadership and vision, but it doesn't necessarily require loads and loads of money. It takes a bit of investment, but it's more about having a different approach. So I think I would be sort of hopeful that it would be possible to make people feel more confident about going into work. But that's not necessarily about changing their financial incentives. It's just about having a system that provides security as a springboard for people to try things where they're not sure if it's going to work out.
Great, really interesting. Time is ticking, I'm afraid, and apologies, I know we started just a tiny bit late as well. But let's wrap up with a poll that you can vote on. So I'll just wait for Emma to bring that up. So here it is. So get your fingers twitching on your phones on Slido. What will be the biggest welfare challenge for the next government? And you can only vote for one. Is it going to be rising child poverty? Alex, oh wow. Is it going to be rising unemployment? Actually, that's something we haven't really talked about, but I mean, Alex's chart at the very beginning of his presentation obviously showed the very obvious point that, you know, benefits are there to help people in periods of economic need, and obviously we saw that during the financial crisis and also during the COVID period. Is it going to be rising disability spending? We've talked a lot about that today. Or is it going to be rising pensioner spending? So while you vote, I'm going to ask our panel, which one would you pick, Kitty?
So I would choose, in terms of what I think must be done something urgently about, rising child poverty. However, I think we have very clear levers to do something about that. So if they wanted to raise the fund, if they wanted to do it, they could do it. Whereas rising disability spending, I think, is more complex.
Okay, you've only got one button on your phone here. We're going to put you in rising child poverty.
All right.
Ben, where will you vote?
I'd put rising child poverty, though I also think it connects to rising adult poverty as well. But just levels of deep poverty and destitution is something that needs to be tackled.
Alex, are you going to join the consensus?
Yeah, I mean, I was actually going to say similar to what Kitty said. Is rising child poverty isn't necessarily a challenge; it's just a will.
Yeah,
right?
That's right.
Whereas I would slightly rephrase rising disability spending to just dealing with, I mean, to the extent that that caseload is real, with those caveats, dealing with a rise in ill health is a much bigger challenge than what we have in the benefit system, and often getting those different areas of policy talking to each other can be a big challenge for a government.
Well, just like Kitty wasn't allowed to vote, you're not allowed to do random questions. But anyway, let's find out what people at home and people in the room thought. Wow, okay, so there's quite a strong consensus here, which is the biggest welfare challenge for the next government is rising child poverty. And perhaps some of the discussion today and certainly some of the comments from the panellists might make us feel hopeful that there will be policy change in that direction. We are pretty much timed out, so it just remains to me to say a huge thank you to everybody in the room. It's been an amazingly rich discussion, huge amount of issues stored up for whoever forms the next government. I don't envy really the person who's going to be the new Secretary for State for Work and Pensions, and their in tray is going to be absolutely bulging. The other thing to say is that apologies to those in the room. I didn't get to come to you with the mic, but we're here, so if you want to come and talk to us afterwards, do that. Thank you, Alex, for the amazing paper with Mike. Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Kitty, for your wisdom and always incredibly valuable. And I'm sure the conversation will continue. And thank you to all of you for joining us today. Goodbye.